Without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Barrett Tillman. Let's give him a hand.
This is, can you hear me?
Where you want?
I've got a green light.
You got a green light. Yes, 1, 2. Manly voice.
The thing I have noticed frequently about aviation museums is that some of them don't always live up to the brochure. You know, you hear good things about it, but when Boom drove me up here, and it was an oh my God moment. This is Disneyland for airplane people. I am just so pleased to be here. It's a genuine pleasure. I should mention that my friend, colleague, co-author, and unindicted co-conspirator, Boom Powell, here is one of your World War I pilots, and I would indulge in a brief moment of shameless hype to urge you to go online and look for our epic novel, Duel Over Douai. It was 14 years in the making, and that's what happens when 3 people with 3 different careers decide to collaborate on a novel. We had an enormous amount of fun, almost an obscene amount of fun writing it, and we're proud of the result. But today, obviously, I'm here to talk about World War II and USS Enterprise, CV-6, which was the predecessor to the current Enterprise, which was America's first nuclear-powered flat top. And we were just aboard her yesterday and watching their preparations to get underway for their final deployment. But for CV-6, rightly called the most decorated warship in America's history, she received 20 battle stars for Pacific theater battles and campaigns from 1941 through 45. And as you see a bit later here in the presentation, that extended from Pearl Harbor almost up to VJ Day, a unique record. But a ship, especially an aircraft carrier, is more than the sum of the vessel itself and the crew or even the airplanes. It's an institution. And that was the approach I wanted to take to the Big E, because she truly was an institution. She became a floating leadership factory throughout her entire career, and you'll see towards the end of the presentation what some of the leadership legacy actually involved. So we're looking at a binary process here. We're considering not only the ship, but the men, the planes, and how they emerged into a legend. And it was a fairly lengthy process from before the war. Those of you who are historically inclined will remember that the Roosevelt administration established the Work Progress Administration, which not only built roads and bridges and buildings, but naval vessels as well. And we began to see the story emerging with the launch of USS Enterprise CV-6 in October of 1936. She was the second of the Yorktown class, her older sister having been laid down several months previously. But on October 3rd at Newport News, the Secretary of the Navy's wife, Mrs. Lucy Swanson, commissioned the ship Enterprise, and she therefore became the 7th U.S. naval vessel to bear that name, dating all the way back to the Revolution. So she had a fighting heritage even before she felt water. To show you a little bit about the background and where Enterprise fit into our aircraft carrier history, the first carrier, USS Langley, was, ironically enough, was named for Professor Samuel Pierpont Langley, who was the Wright brothers' bitter rival. And in fact, he had tried to achieve powered flight by launching from a barge on the Potomac River with rather unimpressive results. And nevertheless, he was well connected. He was prominent with the Smithsonian, and America's first carrier bore his name. Langley was a converted collier, kind of an awkward-looking ship. The flight deck was built upon the major superstructure, and she was essentially what today we would call a proof of concept. And upon her narrow wooden deck, the first generation of tailhook aviators paid their tuition, often in blood, on the ramp. But Langley established the viability of the concept, and what they learned from her led to our first fighting carriers, the two Lexington-class ships, commissioned in the late 20s. They were converted under construction from battle cruiser hulls. They were very large, capable vessels, 33,000 to 36,000 tons, capable of over 30 knots and embarking 70 to 80 aircraft. The fourth carrier, USS Ranger, was named for one of John Paul Jones' ships. Never accomplished much. She was a fairly small, limited capability vessel, about 14,000 tons, was only used in combat on 2 occasions, supporting the North African invasion of Morocco in '42 and a hit and run at Norway in 1943. So that takes us up to Yorktown in 1937. Very much a different breed of cat. Obviously smaller than the Lexingtons. The Yorktown carriers displaced typically 20,000 tons when new, and like every ship and every airplane that's ever been built, they bulked up during their service career. That's a look at Enterprise as she appeared brand new in 1938. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that half the airplanes on deck are biplanes. And the following year, when the Second World War erupted in Europe, excuse me, still almost half of U.S. carrier aircraft were biplanes. And consequently, only in the spring and summer of 1941 did U.S. naval aviation totally embark monoplanes. Pretty remarkable situation. This is a quick look at the aircraft that flew from Enterprise. For some reason, I deleted the Hellcat, but it shows the transition. You have biplane Curtiss SBCs, Scouts, and F-3F fighters in the original air group, and by war's end, Corsairs had operated aboard as night fighters of all things, and the last aircraft to come aboard was the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver. So essentially, that's a quick and dirty look at the evolution of U.S. carrier aviation from before World War II up through the end. But mainly I'm going to be talking about people. And some of you land lovers may wonder what you're looking at here. What you're seeing is an ancient tradition lost in the mist of antiquity. It's called the crossing the line ceremony. And when a Navy vessel crosses the equator, the trusty shellbacks, that is those who have done so before, get to inflict all kinds of degradation upon the lowly pollywogs. And this is a collection of pollywogs. This picture was taken either in August or September of 1944 when Enterprise was returning from operations in the Central Pacific back to, I believe, to Majuro Atoll. And they took a day out to have some fun and games, and at the conclusion of this ceremony, the pollywogs were elevated to shellback status. But that was not the first time it had been done aboard the Enterprise, to wit. This is the 1938 crossing the line ceremony during the ship's shakedown cruise to Rio de Janeiro. Now, when I started this book in 2009, there were only 4 plank owners, that is, original crewmen, still known living from 1938. One of them was the fetching young lady on the left. His name was Seaman Second Class Carl Marble, and he was cast in the role of the Royal Princess she's standing there beside her father, King Neptune, with the trident, getting permission to come aboard from Captain Newton White. And I asked Carl, I said, how in the world did you get selected for the role of the Royal Princess? He said, well, I was 19 years old and I had the best legs on the ship. Now, that's the upper portion of the royal court. And the left-hand photo, you will see, again, there's King Neptune with his queen and the royal princess. Lower towards the right, in the front, you'll see the royal baby. And I've forgotten his name, but he was the chief petty officer who was chosen for his rotund appearance. One of the indignities that the lowly pollywogs had to endure was called kissing the royal ham. And the royal ham was the royal baby's rotund belly, which usually was smeared with all kinds of odious mixtures. So there you see the top and the bottom of it. But in addition to the fun and games here, one of the things I was most intrigued to learn was that Enterprise's crew, roughly 21 to 2,200 people, including the air group, was almost hand-picked. The majority of the ship's company, enlisted sailors, had between 2 and 10 years of fleet service, which was extremely rare. Normally, you don't concentrate that many nautical eggs in the same basket. But they were matched up almost on a one-to-one basis with, I think, about 600 recruits straight out of boot camp. So those new sailors immediately benefited from a great deal of institutional knowledge, and that's a recurring theme that you will see throughout the presentation. Now, Enterprise operated both in the Atlantic and the Pacific. In 1940, she transited the Panama Canal, went to San Diego, and subsequently out to Hawaii. And on December 7th, 1941, she was returning from delivering Marine fighters to Wake Island. And heavy weather blew up en route, which delayed her return. And even though there was no state of hostilities, the embarked flag officer, Vice Admiral Halsey, was playing it cautious, and he launched 18 scout bombers to search ahead of the ship, and you can guess what happened. Throughout the day, Enterprise suffered heavy aircraft losses. Of the 18 SBDs, I think 5 were shot down with losses of pilots and crew. The huge majority of them were shot down to what we would today call friendly fire, or blue on blue. Huge confusion, and obviously a violent surprise. That evening, Enterprise was recovering a search strike that had failed to find the Japanese carriers, and consequently 6 Grumman Hellcats, or Wildcats, were detoured into Pearl Harbor. As always, somebody failed to get the message. The anti-aircraft gunners opened fire. 5 of those aircraft were shot down. 3 of the pilots were killed. And that was Enterprise's first day of war. So it was very much a come-as-you-are war, even though tensions have been building in the Pacific over the past several months. And with destruction or heavy damage of the Pacific Fleet battleships at Pearl Harbor, and increasingly discouraging evidence of marginal submarine torpedoes, Admiral Nimitz, who was the brand new commander of the Pacific Fleet, had limited options, and he chose to send his available aircraft carriers on a series of hit-and-run raids throughout the central and western Pacific. And that was marginally helpful in keeping the Japanese off balance, but more than anything else, it gave Enterprise and her other pack fleet carriers, Lexington, Saratoga, and shortly Yorktown, some badly needed combat experience. And that corporate knowledge came to a head 6 months later at the Battle of Midway. Now, Midway island is a misnomer. It's basically two islands forming an atoll about 1,200 miles northwest of Honolulu. The Japanese Navy knew that if there was to be any chance of reaching a favorable settlement with the United States, it would have to be in a situation in which the American Pacific Fleet was no longer a factor. Consequently, Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, agreed to a complex operation with the object of seizing Midway and forcing the Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle. It was a 3-day affair, mainly decided on the morning of June 4th. And I think probably most of you are acquainted with the chronology of the battle. So rather than relate blow for blow, I want to emphasize again the recurring role of leadership in Enterprise's history. And I'll show you two of the major players. On the left, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, 40 years old, graduate of Annapolis 18 years previously to the day, who launched with his two Dauntless squadrons, one Scout, one Bomber, about 31 aircraft, and was ordered to proceed on his own because of problems in launching Enterprise's torpedo planes and fighters. He flew southwest from the launch position, expecting to intercept the Japanese carriers about 150 to 60 nautical miles out. He intersected the projected Japanese track, found nothing, and at that point, Lieutenant Commander made the single most important decision, not only of the battle, but perhaps in the history of the Pacific War. And I think to put that in perspective, it's as if a British major had decided the issue at Waterloo. Because Wade McCluskey could do two things. He could turn left and look towards Midway, or he could turn right and fly up the reverse of the Japanese projected track. He decided to go right. A few minutes later, he crossed paths with a Japanese destroyer pulling a high-speed wake to the northeast, rightly concluded that it was rejoining the carriers, and about 15 minutes later, through his binoculars, he was looking at 4 Japanese flight decks. He immediately ordered an attack, but in the confusion, and Wade McCluskey was a fighter pilot by trade. He had previously commanded the Wildcat Squadron, and there was a mix-up, and about 27 Dauntlesses dived on one carrier and tore the living bejabbers out of it. But that left my late great friend Dick Best, the bombing squadron skipper, with 2 wingmen to tackle the next nearest carrier. That turned out to be Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's flagship, the Akagi. Now, Dick Best was a fascinating individual. He was from New Jersey, very much a New Deal Democrat, huge admirer of FDR, and he's, out of the few hundred combat veterans I've known, he's one of a handful of whom I can say he absolutely was a war lover. He loved what he was doing. It never occurred to him, after he sent his family back to the States in January of '42, that he would go home until the war was over. He wanted to be there at the absolute end. He also had the goal of becoming the best dive bomber in the Pacific Fleet, and on that day he probably was. He personally got the decisive hit that sank Kagi, and later that day he flew a second mission, led the few remaining aircraft from bombing 6 against the Hiryu with overflow from the Yorktown, which had been damaged. And that day, Dick Best flew 2 missions, 2 bombs, 2 hits, 2 carriers sunk, 2 traps, and his career was over. He had ingested some toxic fumes from his oxygen bottle, which resulted in a freak accident, activated latent tuberculosis, and that ended his Navy career. He never got over that. When I first interviewed him in about 1975, he said that it had taken him a couple of decades to realize that the last day he touched the stick, he sank 2 carriers, and how are you ever going to top that? Enterprise's scoreboard at Midway was 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers. As I said, the 4th one, the Soryu, was sunk by Yorktown dive bombers, and Yorktown herself was lost in 2 strikes from Hiryu before she was sunk. So Enterprise early on established herself as the worst enemy of the Imperial Navy. And when you look at her contribution to the war in the Pacific, and I deal with this late in the book, try the reverse. What would have happened had Enterprise been caught in Pearl Harbor? What would have happened if Enterprise had been lost at Midway? Well, if that had happened, we would not have been able to launch America's first strategic offensive of the war, which was the Guadalcanal campaign in August of 1942, because we couldn't do it without seagoing air power. Guadalcanal is remote from anywhere and well beyond range of land-based fighters. 2 of the standouts of the early phase of the Guadalcanal campaign, on the left is warrant machinist Donald Runyon, who had been an enlisted pilot before the war, flew in arguably the most famous Navy squadron of the 1930s, Fighting II, the Flying Chiefs, which, except for a few officers, was entirely staffed by petty officers. He became not only Enterprise's, but the U.S. Navy's top fighter ace of that part of the war. He finished with 9 credited victories. On the right, arguably the standout scout bomber pilot, Lieutenant Stockton Burning Strong. Now, he was a slight, short perfectionist, and one of his later subordinates said he was the most obnoxious little SOB you ever met, but he was really, really good. And what people most hated about Burning Strong was that he would not only tell you that he was the best there was, he kept proving it throughout his career. So how are you possibly going to compete with that? He flew what I still consider the finest single mission ever launched from aircraft carriers. At the Battle of Santa Cruz in October of 1942, he was on a search strike with his wingman, got a contact report of battleships in the adjacent sector, turned in that direction, and en route to the battleships, he monitored another contact report of Japanese carriers, ran the time distance, fuel computation, and said, I think I can do it. And in just a brilliantly executed mission, he and his wingmen both got hits on a Japanese light carrier, knocked it out of the battle, and navigated back to Enterprise, landing on fumes. I forget how many gallons they had, but it was something on the order of 10 gallons remaining. Just a superb, superb mission. But Enterprise also took damage in both battles at Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz. The picture on the left has been widely reproduced over the years, and usually with an erroneous caption. It says that the photographer who took this shot was killed in the explosion. He was not. This photographer was aft on the island looking towards the stern. The photographer who was killed in that same attack was farther forward, port side, I think. But still, it's a dramatic picture. On the right, you'll see a damage control crew at work on the third deck, which is below the hangar deck. And throughout the war, especially in 42, 44, 45, Enterprise arguably became the most experienced damage control crew in the U.S. Navy. The ship was blessed with 2 or 3 superb DC officers, and I address both of them in the book. Now, as I said, the Guadalcanal campaign extended into October and beyond, and 2 of the standouts from that are familiar names to some of you. I want to point out Lieutenant Commander Jim Flatley, skipper of Fighting Squadron 10, better known as the Grim Reapers, and his exec commander, William R. Kane. By the way, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Flatley family is represented in the audience here today. Essentially a naval aviation dynasty. I think there's now 4 generations of naval officers. Jim Flatley was well experienced. He had flown from the Yorktown in the Battle of Coral Sea, called back home, stood up the Grim Reapers and took them out with Air Group 10. And Killer Kane was a very well regarded Annapolis athlete before the war, a big strapping guy, wrestler. And one of the secrets that he kept throughout most of the war was that his vision had deteriorated. Officially, he should not have been flying, but he found himself a couple of seeing eye ensigns, and they were able to get the skipper within 1,000 feet or so of an airborne enemy aircraft, and Kane shot down 6 of them throughout the war. So I mention that to demonstrate the degree of motivation and determination that you find time and time again in the Big E. These guys knew what was at stake, and they were not going to let anyone down. 2 other standouts from the Guadalcanal campaign. On the left, the landing signal officer, Robin Lindsay, and on the right, one of Flatley's superb pilots, Lieutenant Stanley Swede Betasa. At Santa Cruz, Enterprise's youngest sister, the third of the class, was mortally damaged and eventually sank. And that left part of her air group orphaned. And consequently, Robin was willing to bring aboard as many aircraft as he possibly could. When I interviewed him years and years ago, he said that he realized most of the airborne airplanes were SBVs. That was our major striking arm, and we needed to preserve as many as possible. The problem was that a bomb hit had jammed the forward elevator in the down position, and that limited the parking area available for aircraft. And consequently, Robin was required to what we call cut, that is, give the chop the throttle signal to pilots farther and farther out from the ramp, because the overflow of the extra planes was covering up the arresting wires progressively towards the stern. Last pilot airborne was Swede Betasa, who had one of the finest days any American fighter pilot ever had. He was credited with shooting down 7 Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes in one mission. And Swede had allowed his wingmen to land before him so that they would have more space on the deck. And Robin knew he would have to cut Swede onto the 1 wire. Now, unlike present aircraft carriers, Enterprise, I think, had 8 arresting wires. But on the afternoon of October 26th, only the wire closest to the ramp was available. Swede said that Robin gave him a high dip, which means bunt the nose, drop it down a little bit. And from Swede's perspective, he was looking at the edge of the ramp. But he trusted Robin implicitly. Robin regarded Swede as one of the finest aviators afloat, cut him long in the groove, as they say, and he trapped on the last available wire, and people in the catwalk stood up and cheered because they recognized they had just witnessed a virtuoso performance. So there again, that's the quality of people we had flying for Enterprise. But even an aircraft carrier, which obviously is oriented towards flying, is still a fairly large naval vessel with, in this case, about 2,500, close to 3,000 people who don't fly. And the individuals most responsible for the efficient operation of the crew, as opposed to driving the boat, are the executive officers. And I want briefly to talk about 2 of them. John Crommelin, on the left, was one of those rare people who did everything extremely well. He graduated near the top of his Annapolis class. He was a superb aviator. As a broken down, decrepit old man of 40, he could outfly just about any of the young studs in the air group. And he was so well regarded by officers and sailors alike that he became known as Uncle John. And in fact, some sailors addressed him as Commander Uncle John, sir. If you had ever been an Enterprise sailor, later Captain Crommelin's door was open to you. I heard from, I think, 2 Enterprise guys who had problems later in their careers after the war, and on each occasion they looked up Captain Uncle John Crommelin, who interceded for them. So he was one of the types of naval officers who would always go out of his way to support his people. He rolled out in 1943 and was relieved by Commander Tom Hamilton. Any of you who are serious football fans will recognize his name as Navy's pre-war football coach. He had a winning 3 seasons, I believe, and subsequently was selected by the Navy Bureau of Personnel, then the Bureau of Navigation, to oversee the training, the physical training and conditioning syllabus for naval aviation cadets. And after the war, he returned to Annapolis and resumed coaching. But in the meantime, the guys flying the airplanes were not always pilots. On the left, one of my most valued, most respected friends from the Enterprise gang was Commander Bill Martin, who had an unprecedented 3 combat tours in the Enterprise as a scout pilot, as a torpedo squadron commander, and finally as air group commander. Bill, again, was an Annapolis product who treasured the contributions that his enlisted air crew made, and unfortunately the fellows he's with in this picture, Williams and Hargrove, were killed when his TBF was shot down at Saipan, and Bill narrowly escaped, but he was rescued and returned to flying. The right-hand picture I chose partly because I just love the Douglas Dauntless. My dad and I restored and flew one in the 1970s, and I always have a soft spot for the SPD. But not only does this picture demonstrate the relationship between the pilot and the radioman gunner with the twin 30 caliber machine guns, but it also shows the plane captain, who typically was 18 to 20 years old, a sailor specifically trained to look after a particular make and model of airplane, and he oversaw the servicing and in some ways the maintenance. So I think that's a microcosm of the teamwork that made carrier aviation so successful. Now, I mentioned that Bill Martin was the skipper of Torpedo 10, and he had always been an advocate of night carrier operations, and in fact, as a junior officer, he had written the first tentative manual for night flying from aircraft carriers. That was hardly ever thought of, at least in the U.S. Navy. The Japanese and the British navies experimented somewhat more with it. But Bill and Butch O'Hare were really the pioneers, and I'm sure almost all of you know about Butch O'Hare. He was the Navy's first fighter ace of World War II, received the Medal of Honor for his single-handed defense of the Lexington off Rabaul in February of '42. Came to the Big E as Air Group Commander in late '43 and developed what he called BAT teams. That was a radar-equipped Avenger with 2 standard Hellcats operating under radar control to intercept enemy bombers. Butch was killed under still mysterious circumstances on one of those early missions in November '43. But shortly thereafter, Air Group 10 came back aboard for a second cruise, and he developed the low-level night radar attack procedures that Torpedo 10 proved spectacularly in an attack on Truk Atoll in the Caroline Highlands in February of '44, and from there on, it was a done deal. If Bill Martin was at the throttle, the squadron was going to operate at night as well as at day. On the right is Chick Harmer, Richard E. Harmer, another acquaintance of mine from Enterprise days. He had been a Wildcat pilot aboard the Saratoga in the Guadalcanal campaign, and thought there has to be more we can do with carrier fighters. And he was such an enthusiast for the concept of radar-equipped fighter aircraft that he volunteered for what became the Navy's first carrier-borne night fighter squadron, oddly enough, flying Corsairs. Now, those of you who are familiar with the F-4U will recall that it was known as a man killer. It was extremely demanding to land aboard carrier, and consequently, it did not do so in large numbers almost until 1945. But Chick Harmer handpicked his pilots, and they operated with complete safety from the Enterprise for the first half of 1944, and shot down about half a dozen Japanese aircraft with no combat losses. So again, they really proved the job. Quick tip of the hat to the folks who work the deck. Carrier sailors call it the gang on the roof. On the left, you'll see a swarm of plane handlers sacking out on the flight deck between launches and recoveries. In those days, a typical carrier's workday was 14 to 15 hours. Today, it can easily be 24 hours because of the advancing technology, procedures, and equipment. But in those days, most of the aircraft were moved by muscle power. There were simply not enough room for tractors to do all the job. Additionally, upper right, you'll see some of the ordnance men arming a bomb on a Dauntless. And lower right, fairly famous photo. This occurred at the time Butch O'Hare came aboard in November 1943. This young VF-2 fighter pilot got left of center line, bounced into the catwalk. That crushed the external fuel tank, which ignited, and the extremely courageous officer climbing on the tank to help the pilot out was the catapult and arresting gear officer, Lieutenant Walt Schuning. So there again, a remarkable demonstration. Up to June 1944 now, and Enterprise is one of 15 fast carriers in Task Force 58, and the only one, of course, which had ever fought Japanese carriers among all those ships. In the two-day event known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan's remaining carrier air power was shot to rags and tatters. We destroyed something like 300 enemy aircraft. Submarines sank 2 of the 9 Japanese carriers. And on the left, you'll see one of the Grim Reapers, Don Flash Gordon, who I think was here not too terribly long ago. He's now deceased. He's climbing out after shooting down 2 Japanese planes during the Turkey shoot. On the right is a strike photo from the next day, or actually the next afternoon, June 20th, 1944, when Air Group 10 was part of a strike group of about 225 aircraft that attacked the withdrawing Japanese carrier. This probably is the light carrier Junyo, which was not sunk, but bombing 10 under Jigdog Ramage damaged it, and she never returned to the operational status. That fall, we're up to October 1944, and the 3-day Battle of Leyte Gulf. Enterprise had a new air group aboard at that time, Commander Dog Smith's CAG-20, one of the most aggressive, most capable air groups ever to deploy in the Pacific Theater. And in 2 days, they helped sink one of the 2 largest ships ever built up to that time, the Japanese battleship Musashi. And the next day off Cape Engano, up northeast of the Philippines, they sank at least 1 and maybe 2 Japanese carriers. Those were the last 4 Japanese carriers ever to deploy, and all were lost. I tried to do a matchup with the timelines between Air Group 20's reports and the Japanese, and there's not enough Japanese records available to sort it out, so they might have hit the same carrier twice. But in any case, Enterprise continued racking up a tremendous record. But along the way, in writing this book, I realized that it would not be complete without a closer look at the Japanese, and I was fortunate in being able to do that. On the left is a dive bomber commanding officer from the Japanese carrier Shokaku, and he and his pilot had a unique record. They attacked the Enterprise twice, once at Eastern Solomons, once at Santa Cruz, and they hit her both times. Nobody else came close to doing that. On the right is the last Japanese aviator to inflict damage upon Enterprise, and he was a kamikaze pilot named Shunsuke Tomiyasu. Impressive young man, 22 years old, recent graduate of the Etajima Naval Academy, extremely motivated, and his last letter to his family has been translated, and his parting words were, "Live with great enthusiasm." And he also flew with great enthusiasm. May 14th, 1945, Enterprise is operating with her task group, I think about 100, 150 miles off Kyushu, which was where most of the kamikazes were at. And Tomiyasu was one of, I believe, 26 Zeros launched that morning against the task force. And he was practically the only one to penetrate the Hellcat Combat Air Patrol and the flak. On the picture on the left is not inverted. That is the dramatic photo that an Enterprise photographer got. It's Tomiyasu essentially on short final. He saw that he was going to overshoot the ship from starboard to port. So he half snapped to inverted, pulled the stick back, and flew the first half of a split S down the forward elevator well. An A-zone hit. And you'll see the photo on the right. The huge explosion lofted approximately half of that 15-ton aircraft elevator about 400 feet into the air. And 12 sailors were killed, but the structural damage to the ship was severe. It was such that she could not be repaired in Pearl Harbor, and she proceeded to Bremerton, where she spent the rest of the war. Now, one of the things I most enjoy about what I do is the unexpected. You never quite know what's coming around the corner at you. And about a year and a half ago, I opened my mailbox, found a handwritten letter, or a hand-addressed letter in a script I did not recognize. I opened it, and there was another note that said, "Thought you might like to have this." That is a paper note, 50 sen, worth approximately a dime, that was removed from the pocket of Lieutenant G.G. Shunsuke Tomiyasu. And I was just stunned. I thought, what in the world am I going to do with this? I still don't know for sure. I'm keeping it in a cool, dry place where it'll be preserved, but obviously it should be shared with the world. I just don't know how that would best be done. It's intact, a little bit flimsy, and I'm concerned about having it exposed to direct light. So we'll have to give some thought to that. I need to talk to some archivists. But in the meantime, I want to move on to Enterprise's leadership legacy. The pilot in the cockpit, my dear friend, Rear Admiral Jigdog Ramage, one of the finest naval officers and finest people I've ever known. And he is unique to the Enterprise. He was aboard directly out of Annapolis in 1939 as an ensign in ship's company, came back in 43 as an aviator, and later commanded Bombing 10. And you can read the quote. He says, "In the Enterprise, I learned that loyalty down breeds loyalty up. And believe you me, that is not a universal attitude in the military. But it certainly was for most Enterprise folks, as I've already mentioned, with the executive officers, John Cromwell and Tom Hamilton. On the right, you'll see a list of notables who served aboard Enterprise and later made marks, starting with Admiral Tom Moore, who was a pre-war fighter pilot and became not only Chief of Naval Operations in the early 70s, but chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Vice Admiral Vincent Lacroix flew Wildcats in 1942 from the Enterprise and became the first commanding officer of the current Enterprise, CDN 65. So some continuity there. Getting down more towards the bottom, Captain Roy Boris. Some of you will know him as Butch Boris, who was the first commanding officer of the Blue Angels. And he had retained contact with some of his squadron mates from the Grim Reapers, and there was a heavy VF-10 content in the early Blue Angels teams. Jack Taylor was aboard in VF-20, and he loved his ship so much that he named his rental car company after him. So that's the origin there. And another sports figure, Lieutenant J.G. Bud Wilkinson, was a hangar deck officer when Tomiyasu dived his Zeke down the front elevator. And he went on to stellar post-war career as Oklahoma's football coach. But I want to emphasize some of the other leaders, including those who were non-commissioned. Unfortunately, I never got to know the gentleman on the left, Chief B.H. Beans. And to this day, nobody in the Enterprise Association can tell me what his initials stood for. He was always known as Bulkhead. He was a big, brawny guy who was the ship's master-at-arms, which is basically the police chief. He handled problems that just short of whatever the Marine detachment might do. He was beloved by everybody aboard ship. And my favorite story about Bulkhead is that on one occasion in 1944, he went into the captain's office. The captain was gone, and there were some miscreants kneeling on a blanket on the deck, having a nice poker game. And apparently they figured nobody would ever think to look for an illegal poker game in a captain's country. Well, Bulkhead immediately was faced with a dilemma. He could do one of two things. He could bust them, which he really didn't want to do, or he could try to pretend that he didn't see them, but they had already seen him, and he was as big as a bulkhead. There's no missing him. So something else occurred to him. He knelt down and asked, "What's the ante?" And one of the miscreants said, "4 bits, Chief." So he anteed up, and I don't know how long this game lasted. Obviously, it was quite a while, because Bulkhead Beans in 1944 won $17,000. Now, if you run the numbers, that's something over 200 grand today. And in the 1940s, you could buy a fairly decent house for 4,000 or 5,000 and a new car for 800 or 900. But Bulkhead was such an ethical individual that he made sure he lost $17,000 before he broke up the game. And one of the sailors said, the chief wandered off whistling to himself, just as happy as he could be. On the right, Ensign Jerry Flynn was a pixie-ish Irishman. He had been a Notre Dame cheerleader before the war, and one of his duties was a morale officer. And he was in a constant feud with the task group commander, Rear Admiral Blackjack Reeves. Blackjack got his name not for any acumen at gambling, but for his disposition. And they had a constant feud going on. On one occasion, probably early '44, they were operating off New Guinea, and Reeves glassed a bogey out there, and he said, "Ensign Flynn, what's that aircraft?" Flynn looked and he said, "Looks like a B-25, sir." And Reeves said, "No, it's a B-26. And Flynn, who typically said what he thought, piped up and he said, "Well, sir, I'll bet a week of my pay against a week of yours." And he spent the next week in hack, but the captain finally let him out. So I mentioned that to show that Enterprise was never much of a regulation type of ship. In fact, one of the sailors said, "You know, we weren't worth a damn ashore, but we were all business at sea." I include this to show the remarkable longevity among Enterprise men. When the ship was decommissioned in 1946, these 4 had been aboard for the entire time the ship was in commission, from 1938 to 1946. If anything similar to that happened on many other ships, I am unaware of it. I do know that because of the longevity of some ships today, such as the current Enterprise, which is now 51 years old, you do find a few non-commissioned people with that type of longevity. But Enterprise just had enormous human resources to rely upon. In fact, I think about 120 sailors and 1 or 2 officers were aboard for the entire period of the war, so they were entitled to all 20 of those battle stars. Quick summary, at the end of the war, Secretary of the Navy Forrestal said, Enterprise is the one ship that most nearly epitomizes the history of the U.S. Navy in this war, and that's certainly true. There was a strong effort led by Admiral Halsey to try to preserve the ship as a museum, but the Navy could not find its way to do so. The official reason was that it cost too much to mothball an aircraft carrier, and at that time there were probably close to 20 or more brand new carriers of the Essex and Midway classes entering service, so a terrible loss to naval history. The ship was sold in 1956, and in 1958 she was towed from the Brooklyn Navy Yard to Bayonne, New Jersey, where she was dismantled over the next year and a half. This slide was basically for the benefit of the Enterprise sailors I talked to yesterday, to show you how things have changed, not so much technologically, because there's no comparison of the capability of the 2 Enterprises, but down at the bottom of the combat record, it just shows that in World War II, we fought a full-scale 2-ocean Navy war, and Enterprise's record, which is long and distinguished, involved shooting down 1 MiG in Vietnam, and she sank her A-6s, I believe, sank an Iranian gunboat in 1988. Captain Newton White retired in 1938, married well, and built this mansion at a road adjoining the Prince George County Golf Club. And because he and his wife laid out the original plat, they named it Enterprise Road, and it's now a national landmark. Enterprise in public culture takes different directions. The first book about the ship, The Big E, absolutely superb book written by a naval aviator, an active duty naval aviator in 1962, Commander Ed Stafford, is still in limited print. It's twice the length of my book. It's 200,000 words, and is limited almost exclusively to the wartime era. Ed now, I think, is 93 or 94. He's living in Florida, and we exchange emails from time to time. And he urged me to include more of the white hats than he had been able to. That was already my intent, but I was pleased to get that encouragement from him. On the right, those of you who watch the History Channel are familiar with the 10-part series with some excellent computer graphics, Battle 360, which told the wartime story of the Enterprise. This peculiar screenshot is from one of the several movies Enterprise was involved in. This was Dive Bomber, made in 1941, and in this scene, which by the way has Saratoga SB-2Us rather than Enterprise BTs, these pilots and gunners are suffering from some strange malady, either altitude sickness or difficulty sustained under high G in recovering from dive bombing pullouts. The movie starred Earl Flynn and Fred McMurray, who were at odds in the movie. They were rivals. And the movie was filmed in the spring of 1941 for summer release. And Admiral Halsey, who was aboard at the time, bitterly resented the loss of training time. And protested, but to no good. The Navy Department thought that it would benefit as a recruiting film, and on the last day of filming, Halsey leaned over the rail of the flag bridge and said, "Get the hell off my ship." And Earl Flynn, who was constantly in the papers with various scandals, rendered a single-digit salute to the Vice Admiral and dived off the ship into San Diego Bay. So you just imagine, Earl Flynn meets Paul Halsey, and my brain hurts to envision that. A quick look at Big E in the movies. I mentioned Dive Bomber. Flight Command featured F-3Fs from Fighting 6. The Gallant Hours is Jimmy Cagney's tribute to Bull Halsey. Actually, not a very good movie. Tora Tora Tora, we see the Enterprise viewpoint. Midway, 1976, horrible movie. I lost count the first time I saw it of 70 factual or historic errors. But I will say that that movie had a benefit in that it exposed a new generation to the Battle of Midway, the Enterprise, and the Pacific Theater. So perhaps it was not so bad. Winds of War was a pretty good 1980s miniseries, and it's still run on occasion. Now, of course, you can't talk about movies and Enterprise without going to the next step. And yes, I admit I'm a computer nerd, or at least I'm an internet nerd. I had to know how many Enterprise starships there actually were. So if you want to take notes, feel free, because I'm not sure this information is readily available. But I was surprised to learn that there are multiple Starship Enterprises from different classes. The last one, ending question mark 2387, I guess the jury's still out on that. Real quick story. In Mesa, Arizona in the 80s, a buddy of mine was friends with an owner of Blockbuster video stream, and James Doonan was making a tour promoting the first Star Trek movie. And at every one of the stops, there was a galaxy far, far away of trekkers dressed as Starfleet officers, as Romulans, Klingons, heaven knows what. And at each one of them, the last guy in line, wearing his Star Trek uniform, asked Scotty a question from the from the Starfleet manual, and Doonan flicked them off just like that. Last stop of the day, Mike says, "Here's this same guy," and the expression on his face said, "This time I've got him. There's no way Scotty can answer this question." Well, Doonan, recognizing the course, said, "Hello again, laddie," and the trekker asked, "Scotty, how do you explain warp drive in view of the time-space continuum?" And without blinking, Scotty says, "Well, laddie, we learned in the 23rd century that Einstein was wrong." That's my contact information. You needn't worry about writing it down. It's on my website, and I'd be happy to hear from anybody who has comments or questions. And in the meantime, I'm running a little bit late. We're supposed to wrap up by now, but I'm happy to entertain.
How about a hand first?
Do the Phil Donahue thing here.
Yeah,
Walk around,
okay.
a little concerned.
Into the audience, you bet.
How many casualties were there over the World War II time period aboard the Enterprise, including the air wing guys?
The total is a total number of Enterprise KIAs, ships company, and air groups was about 385, which is the third highest behind Franklin with 800 and Bunker Hill with about 550.
Was Ron Lindsay somehow related to John Lindsay, who was the torpedo squadron boy?
No, the torpedo squadron skipper at Midway was Gene Lindsay, and they were not related.
Questions? Oh, here we are.
Sorry.
What prompted the building of the ship so that it became available on the 37 and 38?
As I say, it was part of the Roosevelt administration's public works program. FDR had the option of issuing contracts to various businesses and organizations, and he had been long-term Assistant Secretary of the Navy between the wars. So, of course, his, I think, fifth cousin, Theodore, had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy before he traded in his Washington, D.C. gig for the Rough Riders. At that time, the Navy was willing to, this is early 30s, the Navy recognizes that naval aviation was going to be increasingly important, and we needed more than 4 aircraft carriers.
Going once, going twice. One more.
When was the Enterprise equipped with radar, and how big a role did that play in its air battles?
Enterprise was one of the early ships to receive radar. I think it was early 41. The initial radars that's in the fleet went to 1 or 2 battleships and I believe Yorktown around 1940. So by the time of Pearl Harbor, there had been several months to assimilate radar, start to learn how to use it, mainly as fighter direction for fleet air defense. But as we saw, some visionaries, especially Bill Martin, saw the offensive potential, and he and Butch O'Hare were the ones who made that happen. Yes, sir.
I guess Enterprise was never repaired after the kamikaze strike.
Yes, yeah, she was fully repaired.
Oh, she was. Okay.
Yes, she was due to take another night air group back to the Western Pacific in time for the scheduled invasion of Japan in November of 45. But of course the war ended in August, and she went back to the East Coast and made 3 additional, what they call magic carpet runs, bringing back troops from Europe. And then she shut down in early 46.
Sir? Okay. Are there civilian contractor technicians and tech reps on these ships in World War II?
There were a limited number of tech reps from the aircraft manufacturers, especially Grumman and Douglas. I knew one of the Grumman tech reps, a really great guy named Ralph Clark, who was about 22, 23 years old, took his toolbox from Long Island out to Hawaii, and he kept Wildcats, Avengers, and Hellcats flying for the duration of the war. And just real briefly, I've always appreciated Ralph's description of Grumman's approach to aviation. He called it the shoe clerk approach to aviation. He said, before 1942, almost none of the people who eventually wound up in naval aviation had any previous experience with airplanes. So that's why he called it the shoe clerk approach. He said we had shoe clerks building airplanes, we had shoe clerks maintaining airplanes, and to an extent we had shoe clerks flying airplanes. And the training system was so thorough and so efficient that we produced, I think wartime, 60,000 naval aviators and hundreds of thousands of mechanics, ordnancemen, radarmen. It was just an astonishing accomplishment.
Okay, thanks a lot. Awesome. Bubba's Barbecue is downstairs if you're hungry for lunch, and Fighter Factory and World War I hangar are going to be open for at least a couple hours. So if you haven't seen our B-17 Chucky, she's down in Fighter Factory. So enjoy. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you very much. Very good. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Yeah. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I should have called
There he is. Yeah, there he is.